Hello, and welcome to the very first class of the Hijacked Brain. Today we're going to be talking about Bregman's first chapter, in which he discusses the subject of his book. Basically, he lays out the idea that he's going to be talking about for the rest of the book, and that idea is really twofold. So, for one, on the one hand, Bregman, who's a professor, a Dutch professor from Holland, is going to argue that the notion of human beings as sort of selfish creatures who've been interested in acquiring wealth and power and status more than anything else is deeply embedded in Western culture and Western thought, not just on the sciences, but in the humanities, in finance and economics, obviously, and in many, many other areas of life, including, the art world, for example. So first, Bregman wants to establish this idea: selfishness as a key function of how humans organize their behavior and what is at the root of their natures is widely accepted. Now, the second thing he wants to say is that this is dead wrong, right? That in fact, this idea has sort of shaped the reality we live in to some extent. So it's a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, but also there's lots of counter evidence that suggests that human beings are actually quite different from this. So these are the two kind of main arguments from this chapter. So he's going to start by giving us some case studies, that is, some examples of situations in which humans might be expected to behave badly, right? Natural disasters, or accidents, crashes, terrorist attacks. But what you instead found were people helping each other, right? Throwing themselves into acts of kindness and generosity, even placing themselves at great personal risk in order to help strangers, right? This is called altruism, and we're going to be talking about it, this concept, as the course goes on, right? And this is the idea that human beings are capable of and do often do good things for others without seeking much in return. So this goes against the idea that, let's say, when we're helping people, helping a little old lady across the street, we're doing it because we want to look good, right? Instead, social scientists and behaviorists and psychologists will say, no, that's actually not the case. Human beings help each other because they want to, right? And whether or not it's because they feel good doing it and therefore they have some kind of neurochemical reward, the fact still remains that humans want to help other humans. And you see this particularly in cases when people are placed under extreme stress. Pandemics, Hurricane Katrina is the example that's used right away here, and we're going to be reading about this more in depth later in the course. So he wants to say that a lot of evidence has been compiled, right? And here I think he's just accurate, right? That when people after the fact study what has happened in these kinds of natural disaster scenarios, they often find two things, right? One, which is that people think terrible things are going to happen, right? That there's a panic, that looting is going to break out, that violence will take place, but that instead, what happens typically is that the vast majority of people behave in an altruistic manner towards one another. They seek to help one another, even at a cost personally. Now, that's not to say that everyone behaves like this, but just that really is what you can see as characteristic of the way that humans treat other humans. So this panic that happens when we're worried about an event that's taking place, like a natural disaster or something like this, and that we're afraid that humans will erupt into anarchy and chaos. This is this idea called veneer theory, right? Which a veneer is a thin coating that's placed over top, often of furniture, right? And the idea here is that civilization, that is, behaving respectfully towards one another, is a thin veneer, and that underneath we're very savage creatures, right? And so when circumstances cause this veneer of respect and civility to peel away, what lies underneath is this sort of seething, teeming horde of more ugly motivations like greed, right? And even a thirst for violence, some people will argue. But Bregman wants to ask, first of all, is there any evidence for this? And his answer is there seems to be evidence of its counter, actually, of its opposite. And two, there may be indeed something that unifies human beings, something that we could call human nature. But it's possible that what unites us is actually something better, more moral, and more collaborative in nature, rather than this every man for himself, every person for themselves sort of idea, right? So Bregman then goes on to say, why is this idea that humans have a dark soul so prevalent, right? And who is it that is saying that humans have a dark soul? Well, in some cases, it's academics like me, right? Or other people who are arguing that this is the case, or providing writing about it in such a way as making these kinds of trying to persuade people that this is true. But at least in some cases, Bregman is going to point out, the people who want you to believe that you are not a good person are in positions of power, right? And so he's going to suggest in this chapter that elites, that is, people who are in a position of power and have acquired power, themselves may be trying to tell the world that the world needs them. In other words, if we're dark-souled creatures, then we need powerful people to keep us in check, to keep us from destroying the institutions of civilization that we have surrounded ourselves with, right? That we ourselves, in a sense, are like savage children that need a firm parent, an iron hand, right, in order to keep us from flying apart and flying at each other's throats, right? So he's going to point out, isn't it interesting that the people who talk about law and order and impending crime and destruction tend to be people who are desperate, or at least very interested in holding on to their own positions of power. That is, they are providing an argument for why they should be allowed to exercise power over us, and also why they should be allowed to have access to so many more resources than the rest of us, right? So that there may be, in fact, a kind of a greed element to this. So Bregman uses an example of how an idea can take hold and reproduce itself like a virus in the minds of lots and lots of people. So he gives a famous example about Coca-Cola, in which it was thought that that a bunch of Coca-Cola that was produced in Europe or distributed in Europe was contaminated because there was a rash of sickness throughout Belgium. And it turned out all the Coca-Cola was destroyed and Coke lost a bunch of money. But when healthcare workers and researchers went back over the cases, they discovered that, on the contrary, these children were really feeling sick. They had very severe symptoms, but there was no evidence that Coke had anything to do with it. And so he's going to use this example of how a kind of a panic or a negative idea can take hold, right? and really start to structure our realities. And so he quotes a philosopher here on the mean world syndrome, right? Which is this idea that has taken hold in lots, like I said before, lots of different spheres of life, that the world is a mean place, and that we should be both afraid of other people and also deeply suspicious of our own motivations. So he says, scores of social scientists and historians and social psychologists have described human beings as being motivated primarily by self-interest, right? And have done all kinds of experiments in which they show this to be true. We have tons and tons of movies and books and shows and manga and anime comics of all kinds, and good novels also, which show human beings as capable of resorting to extreme barbarity, right? Like, again, this idea of a veneer of civilization that once peeled back, we become savage, right? Politicians will often present themselves as doing things for your best interest because they assume that you only care about your own best interest. So the presumption here is that you would only ever vote for someone who would give you something directly in return for your vote, right? So that there is, again, a sort of a cynicism about this understood arrangement between politicians and certain of their constituents, right? Then you have religious leaders, not so much anymore, but in some cases, it's still the case that religious leaders will describe human beings as being fundamentally sinful, right? And foolish, easily misguided or caught up in sin, and that they need the moral structure of religion in order to guide them, right? Again, this may be quite helpful for some people, but it's the assumption which is of interest to us here, right? Which is that some of these religious leaders are presenting you with an argument, essentially saying you are fundamentally sinful person, and only the structures of religion will keep you from acting very badly. And then, of course, economists, who are very influential policymakers at the level of government, have been for decades and decades, even over a century now, describing human beings as being driven profit motive. That money is really what motivates people beyond anything else. And finally, environmentalists, and I feel as though all of us should on some level be environmentalists just because it's so important to protect the natural world. However, the narratives of some environmentalists present humanity as a destructive plague, right? In other words, we are an out-of-control destructive plague, and that is fundamentally who we are, right? So again, this kind of like confirms this sort of idea of mean world syndrome. So one of the things that Bregman wants to point out, and it's a little bit challenging to accept this during the time of this pandemic, but nonetheless, the facts remain the facts, that many human development indicators, that is, data points that describe how human beings are doing overall, show marked improvement over the past decades. And some of the really most sad and tragic parts of human existence worldwide have been improving, despite the fact that humans, when asked on surveys, overwhelmingly describe the world as getting worse, right? So Bregman wants to introduce a couple of reasons for this perhaps misguided belief early on. So first of all, he points out that there are a couple of cognitive biases, that is, automatic things that our brains tend to do, that may be part of why we have this kind of negative outlook, right? So the first thing that he points out, the first biases that he names, is negativity bias, right? Which is just what it sounds like, in that because humans evolved, and hominids and our ancestors, the great apes, in an environment of scarcity, in which we had a number of predators, and our brains evolved in these contexts as well. It made more sense from a survival standpoint for us to be focused on negative and potentially threatening phenomena than positive ones, right? So, in other words, we were better off overreacting, right? And that would kind of keep us safer than we were saying, it's no big deal, right? So over time, over hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years, our brains kind of wired themselves to pay more attention to potentially threatening phenomena, right? So this is called negativity bias. The second bias that Bregman wants to use to help explain this overwhelmingly negative outlook on human nature is availability bias. So he points out that, our memories are actually pretty imperfect, right? I feel like I can't remember what I did yesterday. But it's just like the fact that human memory is sort of more of a sketchy proposition rather than a kind of literal recording, like a video, of what took place during our lives, right? And so we tend to remember, and again, for obvious reasons, very extreme things that happen. And we live in an environment saturated with media that focuses on extreme negative phenomena, right? So we then tend to presume, because these memories are more available to us, this is why it's called availability bias, that these negative events are more common or more of a feature of our world than they actually are. So, for example, if a terrorist kills someone, which is tragic and terrible, then we tend to assume that terrorism is this very widespread phenomenon, when, of course, the data tells us that we're much more likely to be eaten by an alligator than killed by a terrorist. So, these are the two biases that he wants to focus on. And so then he brings in, I thought was an interesting point here, which is this concept of homo economicus, right? Which is the idea that instead of being homo sapiens, that is thinking man, we are more likely to be homo economicus, economic a man, right? So, sorry about the man, but it's just the way that the Latin has taken place, right? So that means that humanity tends to be defined by these kinds of rationalistic exchanges of goods and services for resources, right? For trades, that everything you do for a reason. If you are kind to someone, it's because you want their support. So underpinning every action you do is a subliminal or an unconscious expectation that you will receive something in return. In other words, it's like everything is a transaction in your life, right? But then psychologists actually tested this proposition over and over again, and they did so around the world, including looking at hunter-gatherer groups who live outside of modern civilization, right? In extremely remote parts of the planet. And what they discovered was humans just aren't like that, that we don't operate in that way, that we have a much more nuanced way of working, that sure, certain things are transactional, but many things aren't. And so it makes no sense to refer to people as homo economicus. However, there is a creature that does act very transactionally, which is the chimpanzee. As the researcher in the book I thought sort of humorously noted, right? Homo economicus is real, except that it's not a human. It's a chimp. So we'll come back to that again. But I think it's true that in this chapter, Bregman does provide us with enough evidence for his claim that a selfish, darker notion of human nature and human beings in general is really inside Western culture and inside Western thought. And by being so central, it's actually kind of structuring the ways that we behave in the modern world on a day-to-day level without us even knowing it. And he lists a number of different Western thinkers on this subject who describe human beings as sort of bad from different kinds of angles, so religious, historical, also political, etc. And so finally, Bregman leaves us with this, I think, kind of nice notion, right? Which is that it's harder to be an optimist because of this tendency to think of human beings as these sort of dark creatures. But it may, in fact, be more practical, better for us, and perhaps even reflect a kind of hidden reality that has been understudied. So we're going to explore that more over the course of the semester. And thank you very much for your time. See ya.